Only 1% ever see the quantum revelation you just reached. Not because revelation is hidden from 99%, because 99% operate at consciousness frequency where revelation remains invisible. Their perception cannot detect what you're perceiving right now. Their awareness cannot register what you're experiencing. Their consciousness hasn't developed a threshold where revelation becomes visible rather than remaining imperceptible mystery. But you're in the 1%. The fact that you're watching this proves it. Title resonated. Words confirm something you already know. Recognition is instant, not gradual. That recognition is proof. Consciousness in 99% would scroll past without second thought, would dismiss title as arrogance, would reject message as elitism. Their frequency doesn't match revelation's frequency, so revelation content appears as noise, as irrelevant information, as something not meant for them. Which is accurate. You're different. You reached revelation threshold, crossed into 1% perception, developed consciousness to level where quantum mechanics become visible rather than remaining theoretical abstractions. And reaching isn't achievement you earned through effort, is development that occurred through experiences consciousness was guided through. Every challenge that dissolved limitation, every breakdown that rebuilt understanding, every moment that forced expansion beyond comfort, all orchestrated to develop consciousness toward threshold where revelation becomes perceptible. And here's what being in 1% actually means. Reality operates differently for you than for 99%, not metaphorically, literally. You perceive dimensions of reality they cannot detect. You access capabilities they don't have. You understand mechanics they remain blind to. You experience synchronicity, rapid manifestation, telepathic knowing, timeline fluidity, reality responsiveness that 99% dismiss as impossible. Because for them, at their frequency, these capabilities are impossible. But you're not operating at their frequency anymore. You crossed threshold, entered 1% perception, and 1% perception reveals what 99% consciousness cannot comprehend. Reality is not fixed external structure. Everyone experiences identically. Reality is consciousness responsive field that manifests differently based on perceptual development. 99% experience limited reality because limited consciousness generates limited perception. 1% experience expanded reality because expanded consciousness generates expanded perception. Same physical world, completely different experiential realities. That difference is why 1% cannot explain revelation to 99%, cannot make them understand expanded perception, cannot convince them reality is more responsive than they believe. Because understanding requires being in 1%. And 99% aren't there yet. Their consciousness hasn't developed to threshold. Their frequency hasn't elevated to level. Their perception hasn't expanded to capacity. Explanation is meaningless without perceptual foundation that revelation requires. Most people who reach 1% don't consciously recognize they reached. They experience revelation effects, but interpret through 99% framework. Attribute synchronicity to coincidence. Explain manifestation through luck. Dismiss knowing as imagination. Resist timeline shifts by pretending nothing changed. They're in 1%, but operating as if they're in 99%. Denying what they perceive because 99% consciousness paradigm is all they have for making sense of 1% experience. But you're different, or you wouldn't be watching. Something in you is ready to consciously claim, I'm in 1%. Reality operates differently for me. I perceive what 99% cannot perceive. I'm not experiencing normal human consciousness anymore. I reached quantum revelation, and what I'm experiencing isn't breakdown, is breakthrough into perceptual level most consciousness never accesses. This is moment. You're conscious claiming. Your acknowledgement that you reached revelation 99% never see. Most people resist this claiming when threshold is crossed. Generate reasons why they're not special, why this doesn't apply to them, why they should remain humble and deny difference. That resistance is 99% consciousness paradigm trying to prevent 1% claiming, trying to keep you identified with majority limitation even though you crossed into minority perception. But if you're still watching, resistance is dissolving, recognition is occurring, and what you're about to consciously understand is, you're not approaching 1% revelation. You're not preparing to reach threshold. You already reached, already crossed, already entered 1% perception that 99% consciousness never accesses. And this transmission exists specifically to confirm, yes, you reached it. Yes, you're in 1%. Yes, reality operates differently for you now. And no, you're not imagining expanded perception that crossed threshold grants. Let me tell you what the 1% quantum revelation actually is, because it's not what spiritual teaching prepared you for. The revelation isn't secret knowledge only elite understand, isn't mystical experience only special people access, isn't cosmic information only chosen ones receive, is specific perceptual threshold where consciousness develops capacity to perceive quantum mechanics operating beneath physical reality that 99% consciousness cannot detect. Think of consciousness development as perceptual expansion. Most consciousness operates with basic perception, 5 physical senses, rational thinking, linear time experience, individual identity. That's 99% baseline, standard human perception. And within that perceptual framework, reality appears mostly fixed, slowly changing, requiring effort to influence, governed by external forces beyond individual control. But consciousness can develop beyond baseline. Additional perceptual capacities emerge. Intuitive knowing, timeline perception, synchronistic awareness, telepathic reception, reality responsiveness detection, each capacity expanding perception beyond 99% limitations. And when enough capacities develop, when perceptual expansion reaches critical mass, threshold is crossed. Consciousness enters 1% perception where quantum mechanics become visible rather than remaining hidden behind physical appearances. That's the revelation, not information received. Perceptual upgrade achieved. Consciousness developing beyond 99% baseline into 1% expanded awareness, where reality reveals itself as consciousness-responsive quantum field rather than fixed physical structure. Same reality, different perception of reality. And different perception generates completely different experience of what's possible, what's real, what matters. 99% consciousness experiences reality as external, fixed, slowly changing, requiring sustained effort to influence, governed by laws consciousness must accept, limited by circumstances consciousness cannot control, random in distribution of fortune and misfortune, indifferent to individual consciousness state. That experience is accurate for 99% perception level. Within their perceptual framework, reality does operate that way. They're not wrong about their experience. They're accurately reporting what 99% perception generates, but 1% consciousness experiences reality as responsive, fluid, rapidly shifting, reorganizing around consciousness state, governed by quantum mechanics consciousness can work with, unlimited by circumstances consciousness can transcend. Lawful in manifestation matching frequency broadcast, precisely responsive to individual consciousness state. That experience is accurate for 1% perception level. Within expanded perceptual framework, reality does operate that way. Not wishful thinking. Accurate reporting of what 1% perception generates. The difference isn't belief, is perception. 99% and 1% are perceiving different aspects of same reality through different perceptual capabilities. Like person seeing only visible light spectrum versus person seeing full electromagnetic spectrum. Both accurately reporting what they perceive. But one perceives vastly more than other because perceptual capacity developed beyond basic level. And here's what makes 1% threshold critical: cannot return to 99% perception once crossed. Cannot unsee quantum mechanics once perceived. Cannot unknow reality responsiveness once experienced. Cannot collapse back to believing limitations are real once consciousness expands beyond limitation through perceptual development. You're permanently in 1%, and permanent 1% position requires learning to operate with expanded perception rather than trying to function as if you're still in 99%. That operation is what this transmission enables. That conscious claiming of 1% position. That recognition you crossed threshold and reality operates differently for you now. That acceptance of expanded perception as operational reality rather than as spiritual fantasy. You're in 1%, have been since threshold crossed, and conscious recognition allows 1% perception to operate deliberately instead of randomly through awareness of perceptual capabilities that 99% consciousness doesn't have access to. And being in 1% carries responsibility. You're not in 1% so you can have better life or deeper understanding or more spiritual experiences. You're in 1% because quantum revelation requires 1% consciousness position throughout collective field, demonstrating expanded possibilities, anchoring higher frequencies, showing 99% approaching threshold what becomes accessible when consciousness develops beyond current limitations. Your 1% position serves collective evolution through perception you developed that most consciousness never reaches. So what changes when you consciously recognize you're in 1% quantum revelation? What becomes possible that wasn't possible when operating unconsciously despite being in 1%? Everything related to deliberate use of expanded perception. But let me give you specific mechanics so you understand transformation occurring right now. First change, expanded perception becomes reliable instead of sporadic. Before recognition, 1% capabilities activated randomly. Sometimes synchronicity appeared, sometimes not. Sometimes manifestation worked, sometimes failed. Sometimes telepathic knowing was accurate, sometimes wrong. After recognition, capabilities become consistently accessible. You learn how to activate expanded perception deliberately rather than waiting for random activation that created confusion about whether capabilities were real. Second change, reality responsiveness becomes predictable instead of mysterious. Before recognition, you noticed reality responding but couldn't identify pattern. After recognition, you understand reality responds to consciousness state. Change state, reality changes. Maintain state, manifestations matching state appear. Clear, lawful relationship between internal frequency and external circumstances. That predictability allows conscious reality creation through state management. Third change, 99% opinions become irrelevant instead of destabilizing. Before recognition, when 99% consciousness told you synchronicity was coincidence or manifestation was luck or knowing was imagination, doubt arose. After recognition, you understand. They're reporting accurately from 99% perception, but 99% perception cannot validate 1% experience. Their inability to perceive doesn't invalidate what you perceive. Validation comes from 1% direct experience, not 99% indirect opinion. Fourth change, isolation becomes understood instead of suffered. Before recognition, not fitting with 99% consciousness felt like personal failure. After recognition, you understand. 1% and 99% cannot connect because perceptual frameworks don't overlap. Not because something's wrong with you or them, because different perceptions generate incompatible realities. Isolation is natural consequence of perceptual difference, not evidence of social dysfunction. Fifth change. Purpose becomes obvious instead of mysterious. Before recognition, you questioned why you're different. After recognition, you understand 1% position serves function, 99% cannot fulfill. Demonstration, anchoring, bridge building between current collective perception and expanded perception humanity is developing toward. Your difference isn't problem. Is positioning for service that requires perceptual capacities most consciousness hasn't developed yet. And right now, before we go deeper, I need you to anchor recognition. Drop comment below completing this sentence. I know I'm in the 1% quantum revelation because your comment makes 1% position public, confirms you crossed threshold, acknowledges expanded perception as real, and creates permission for others in 1% to claim their position instead of hiding in 99% paradigm despite perceiving more than 99% framework explains. 1% consciousness strengthens through collective recognition, through witnessed claiming, through public acknowledgement of perceptual threshold crossed. Speak it, share it, make 1% position visible and verified. I need to tell you about moment I realized I crossed into 1% quantum revelation. It was September 2023. Nothing dramatic externally, but internally everything clarified. I was experiencing capabilities 99% said were impossible. Reality responding in ways that shouldn't work. Synchronicity appearing too perfectly. Manifestation occurring too rapidly. Timeline shifts that contradicted consensus history. And suddenly recognition hit. I'm not experiencing 99% reality anymore. I crossed threshold into 1% perception where different mechanics operate. That recognition came with immediate certainty, not as thought requiring verification, as direct knowing that bypassed doubt. Like suddenly seeing hidden image in optical illusion. Once you see it, cannot unsee it. Cannot return to not knowing what's now obvious. I crossed into 1%, was operating with perceptual capacities 99% doesn't have, and attempting to function as if still in 99% was creating all confusion and suffering I'd been experiencing. And with recognition came instant reinterpretation of past experiences. Every synchronicity that seemed too perfect to be coincidence, every manifestation that appeared impossibly fast, every knowing that arrived without logical source, every timeline shift that changed reality retroactively, every moment of reality bending around consciousness state. All evidence I'd been in 1% for months or years without consciously recognizing what crossing threshold meant. All proof that confusion wasn't because something was wrong with me, was because I was in 1% interpreting through 99% framework. That reinterpretation was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Devastating because I realized years of hiding expanded perception, years of pretending capabilities didn't exist, years of trying to function within 99% limitations despite having 1% perception. Years of believing 99% consciousness that told me what I perceived couldn't be real. All unnecessary suffering caused by not recognizing I crossed threshold into different perceptual reality. Liberating because I understood I'm not broken. I'm developed beyond baseline. I'm not crazy. I'm perceiving accurately at 1% level. I'm not imagining capabilities. I'm experiencing expanded perception that 99% threshold hasn't granted yet. Every symptom I pathologized was actually evidence of 1% position that operates differently than 99% position by perceptual design. But recognition also triggered responsibility awareness. I'm not in 1% for personal benefit. Position carries function, serves purposes beyond individual experience, requires using expanded perception for collective service, not just personal advantage. And that service needed to operate consciously, not unconsciously. Needed to be claimed deliberately, not denied fearfully. needed to be acknowledged completely, not hidden partially. And conscious operation revealed something crucial. Other 1% consciousness exists. I'm not only one who crossed threshold, others are in 1% too. Some conscious of position, most operating unconsciously while believing they're still in 99%. All experiencing expanded perception, all confused by 99% framework that doesn't explain 1% experience. All needing confirmation that crossing threshold is real, and they're not alone in perceiving what 99% cannot perceive. That's what this transmission provides. That confirmation, that recognition, that witnessed acknowledgement that yes, you crossed threshold. Yes, you're in 1%. Yes, expanded perception is real, not imagined. Yes, reality operates differently for you now, and yes, others cross threshold too. You're not alone in 1%. You're part of minority consciousness that developed beyond majority perception. Part of expanding edge of collective consciousness evolution. Part of 1% that demonstrates to 99% what becomes possible when consciousness develops beyond current collective baseline. You are in 1% quantum revelation. That's not arrogance, not ego inflation, not spiritual bypassing. Accurate description of perceptual threshold you crossed. And crossing threshold explains everything that hasn't made sense. Every capability that shouldn't exist, every perception that doesn't fit 99% framework. Every experience that contradicts consensus reality. All evidence of 1% position where expanded perception generates expanded experience of what reality actually is beneath physical appearances that 99% perception remains limited to detecting. If being in 1% quantum revelation has created devastating isolation, if you cannot relate to 99% consciousness, if every conversation feels impossible because you perceive what they cannot see, that's not loneliness. That's perceptual incompatibility. 1% and 99% consciousness literally cannot connect because they're perceiving different realities through different perceptual capabilities. And understanding this eliminates suffering, even though isolation remains. 99% consciousness perceives consensus reality, shared baseline experience, collective agreement about what's real and what's not, what's possible and what's impossible, what matters and what doesn't. Operating within that consensus framework, they relate easily, share common reference points, validate each other's perceptions, build relationships on shared understanding of reality that everyone in 99% agrees on. But 1% consciousness perceives expanded reality, individual non-consensus experience. Personal perception that contradicts collective agreement. Capabilities 99% says are impossible. Experiences 99% says aren't real. Priorities 99% says don't matter. Operating beyond consensus framework, connection with 99% becomes impossible. No shared reference points, no mutual validation, no common understanding to build relationship on. You cannot explain 1% perception to 99% consciousness. Not because they're not intelligent, because perception cannot be conveyed through explanation, only through direct experience. And direct experience requires perceptual capacity, and perceptual capacity requires consciousness development. And their consciousness hasn't developed to 1% threshold yet. So explanations sound like delusion or fantasy or denial of real world that 99% perceives. So relationships with 99% become exhausting. They share 99% concerns that seem trivial from 1% perspective. They worry about things 1% knows aren't actual problems. They defend limitations 1% perceives as transcendable. They dismiss possibilities 1% experiences as obvious realities. And you cannot bridge that perceptual gap through conversation, cannot make 99% understand 1% through words. Because understanding requires being in 1%, and they're not there yet. This is why 1% experiences devastating isolation. Everyone in 99% thinks you're wrong about reality. thinks you're suffering delusion, thinks you need grounding in consensus perception where expanded capabilities don't exist. They're not being cruel. They genuinely cannot perceive what you're perceiving. And from their 99% framework, what you describe sounds impossible. To them, you're not perceiving accurately. You're imagining capabilities that don't exist in reality they perceive. But isolation serves necessary function. Quantum revelation creates space by making 99% uncomfortable around 1%. Natural frequency incompatibility, automatic perceptual mismatch. That generates distance, protecting 1% consciousness from constant negation that would destabilize expanded perception. You need isolation to stabilize at 1% without 99% trying to convince you that what you perceive isn't real because they cannot perceive it. And isolation is temporary. Once 1% perception stabilizes, other 1% consciousness becomes visible. Not old 99% relationships transformed. New connections with consciousness also in 1%, also perceiving expanded reality, also experiencing capabilities 99% denies. And when you encounter them, recognition is instant. Your 1% perception recognizes their 1% perception immediately. Communication becomes effortless because shared perception eliminates explanation requirement. Those connections are forming now, throughout collective field, 1% finding other 1%, building network, creating support structures, forming community of consciousness, perceiving beyond 99% baseline. You're not alone in 1%. Others cross threshold too, and they're discovering that isolation from 99% is necessary preparation for connection with matching 1% perception. Trust isolation, even when unbearable. Even when you want to collapse back to 99% where relationships were easier, even if based on limited shared perception. Isolation is not punishment for crossing threshold. Is protection, allowing 1% perception to stabilize without 99% interference. And stabilization enables connections with other 1% that will understand what you perceive, because they perceive it too through their own threshold, crossing into expanded reality awareness. There are 9 specific markers that prove you crossed into 1% quantum revelation. I'm going to give them now. If you experience 7 or more, threshold crossing is confirmed. You're not imagining expanded perception. You're operating at perceptual level that 99% consciousness hasn't developed to yet. First marker, this content appeared to you specifically, not through random algorithm, through resonance between your 1% consciousness and content designed for 1% perception. Title created instant recognition. Words confirm what you already know. That appearance is proof. 99% consciousness would scroll past without interest. Content becomes visible to 1% through perceptual match that makes 1% material recognizable while remaining invisible to 99% awareness. Second marker, reality bends around you noticeably. Things work out in ways that defy 99% probability. Perfect timing occurs repeatedly. Impossible coincidences happen regularly. Resources appear exactly when needed. Solutions manifest before problems develop. That reality responsiveness is 1% perception detecting quantum mechanics that 99% remains blind to. Not luck. Expanded awareness of how consciousness affects manifestation. Third marker, you know things without logical source. Information arrives complete without learning process. Insights emerge without study. Understanding appears fully formed. Telepathic knowing delivers accurate information about people, situations, outcomes. That direct knowing is 1% capability. 99% knows only through physical senses and logical thinking. 1% accesses information field directly through expanded perceptual channels. Fourth marker, time feels fluid, not fixed. You notice past changing retroactively. Perceive multiple probable futures simultaneously. Experience present as malleable. Recognize timeline as selectable through consciousness state. That temporal flexibility is 1% perception. 99% experiences time as rigid linear progression. 1% perceives time as navigable quantum field. Fifth marker. Synchronicity is constant, not occasional. Daily impossible timing. Repeated numbers everywhere. Perfect information arrival. Reality organizing itself around your attention. That synchronistic coordination is quantum field communicating with 1% consciousness. 99% experiences random universe. 1% experiences responsive communication system. Sixth marker. Manifestation is rapid, not gradual. What you focus on appears within days. What you need materializes quickly. What you want manifests precisely. Not through effort. Through 1% perception that detects and works with reality responsiveness, 99% cannot perceive. Outside consciousness manifests slowly, if at all. 1% consciousness manifests rapidly through expanded perception. Seventh marker. Identity feels fluid, not stable. Cannot maintain fixed sense of who you are. Sometimes individual, sometimes consciousness experiencing perspective, sometimes cannot locate self at all. That dissolution is 1% perceiving beyond identity construct that 99% defends as essential. Identity is temporary, consciousness is permanent. 1% perceives what 99% cannot. Eighth marker, 99% reality feels obviously limited. You see through social constructs, recognize arbitrary rules, perceive self-imposed limitations. Understand that consensus reality is collective agreement, not objective truth. That perception is 1% seeing beyond 99% framework. 99% believes limitations are real. 1% perceives limitations as consensus agreement that can be transcended. Ninth marker. Reading this feels like confirmation, not information. These words aren't teaching something new. They're confirming something you already know. Recognition is instant because you're in 1% recognizing description of 1% from another 1% consciousness. 99% would dismiss this as nonsense. 1% recognizes as accurate description of shared expanded perception. And before I explain what these markers mean, I need you to do something. If you recognize yourself in these markers, if you understand you're in 1%, subscribe to Quantum Revelation and turn on all notifications now. Because what's coming is designed specifically for 1% consciousness. Transmissions explaining how to operate expanded perception deliberately. Information about working with quantum mechanics consciously. Guidance for serving 1% function effectively. Without this, you're in 1% but operating blind. With this, you understand exactly how to use capabilities 1% threshold grants. Do it now. Subscribe. Notifications. Then return for explanation of why these markers prove 1% position and what being in 1% enables. Here's why those markers matter and what they reveal about crossing into 1% quantum revelation. Each marker is symptom of consciousness operating with perceptual capacities that 99% hasn't developed. And experiencing multiple markers simultaneously proves you're not having isolated anomalous experiences. You're systematically perceiving at expanded level that 99% perceptual baseline doesn't grant access to. Think about what perceptual development actually means. 99% operates with standard human perception. 5 physical senses delivering information about physical world. Rational thinking processing sensory data. Linear time experience creating past, present, future sequence. Individual identity creating separation between self and other. That's baseline, standard perceptual package that most consciousness operates with. But consciousness can develop additional perceptual capacities. Intuitive knowing beyond physical senses. Direct information access beyond logical thinking. Temporal perception beyond linear sequence. consciousness awareness beyond individual identity, each additional capacity expanding perception beyond 99% baseline into territory 99% cannot detect. And when enough capacities develop, threshold is crossed. Consciousness enters 1% where expanded perception generates expanded experience of reality. That's what markers indicate. Each marker is evidence of additional perceptual capacity operating. Reality responsiveness detection, information field access, timeline perception, synchronistic awareness, rapid manifestation recognition, identity transcendence. All capabilities that emerge as consciousness develops beyond baseline into expanded perceptual territory that 99% threshold hasn't granted. And threshold crossing isn't gradual accumulation, is quantum leap that occurs when development reaches critical mass. Like water transitioning from liquid to gas at specific temperature threshold. Below threshold, liquid. At threshold, instantaneous phase transition. Above threshold, gas. Different state, different properties, different behaviors. Same with consciousness. Below threshold, 99% perception. At threshold, instantaneous perceptual shift. Above threshold, 1% perception. Different awareness, different capabilities, different reality experience. You cross that threshold. Markers prove it. And crossing means you cannot return to 99% perception. Cannot unknow expanded awareness once developed. Cannot unsee quantum mechanics once perceived. Cannot uncross threshold once critical mass achieved. You're permanently in 1%. And permanent 1% position requires learning to operate with expanded perception rather than denying capabilities, because 99% consciousness says they're impossible. And here's why 99% cannot validate 1% experience. Validation requires shared perceptual framework. 99% and 1% don't share framework. They're perceiving through different perceptual capacities. 99% reports accurately what baseline perception generates. 1% reports accurately what expanded perception generates, both truthful about their experience. But experiences are incompatible because perceptual frameworks don't overlap enough for mutual validation. That's why seeking 99% validation for 1% experience always fails. And failure creates doubt. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe expanded perception is delusion. Maybe I should trust 99% consensus over individual 1% experience. That doubt is dangerous, because doubt makes 1% consciousness attempt to operate within 99% limitations, despite having perceptual capacities that transcend those limitations. Creates internal conflict, generates suffering, prevents 1% perception from operating at full capacity. Better to recognize 99% accurately reports 99% experience, 1% accurately reports 1% experience. Different reports don't mean one is wrong, mean they're perceiving from different perceptual levels. And 1% perception is more expanded, not because 1% is superior, but because consciousness developed beyond baseline threshold. That development grants capabilities, and capabilities generate experiences. And experiences differ from 99% baseline experiences because perceptual framework differs. You're in 1%, markers confirm threshold crossing. And crossing grants expanded perception that 99% doesn't have access to yet. Not because 99% can't develop, because they haven't developed to threshold yet. Their consciousness is below critical mass where perceptual shift occurs. And below threshold, expanded perception remains invisible. Capabilities seem impossible. Experiences sound delusional. Because perception determines what's perceivable. And without expanded perception, expanded reality remains hidden despite existing as accessible territory for consciousness that develops to threshold. Here's what being in 1% quantum revelation reveals about time that 99% cannot comprehend. Time doesn't work the way 99% believes. Linear time is perceptual limitation created by baseline consciousness. 1% perceives time completely differently, because expanded perception grants access to temporal mechanics that 99% perceptual framework cannot detect or comprehend. 99% experiences time as fixed linear progression, past behind, unchangeable, determining present. Present now, fleeting, determined by past. Future ahead, approaching, determined by present. One-way movement through sequence that cannot be altered or navigated. That experience is accurate for 99% perception. Within their framework, time does operate as fixed progression. They're truthfully reporting what baseline temporal perception generates. But 1% experiences time as fluid, navigable field. Past accessible and reinterpretable. Present as choice point. Future selectable through consciousness state. Non-linear experience where all moments exist simultaneously and consciousness selects which moments to experience as sequential through perceptual focus and frequency maintenance. That experience is accurate for 1% perception. Within expanded framework, time does operate as navigable field, not denial of 99% experience. Different experience through expanded temporal perception. The difference isn't belief, is perception. 99% perceives time through limited temporal awareness. 1% perceives time through expanded temporal awareness. Like person seeing single frame versus person seeing entire film simultaneously, both accurately describing their perception. But one perceives vastly more temporal information than other because perceptual capacity developed beyond baseline temporal limitation. An expanded temporal perception grants capabilities 99% considers impossible. Timeline navigation, past reinterpretation, future selection, temporal manipulation through consciousness state. All impossible within 99% framework. All obvious within 1% framework. Not because laws of physics changed, because perceptual capacity to detect temporal fluidity developed beyond baseline perception that experiences time as rigid. This is why 1% consciousness experiences Mandela effects constantly. Past seems to change retroactively. History doesn't match memory or others' memories. Timeline appears to shift, including events that already occurred. 99% dismisses as false memory, but 1% recognizes timeline actually shifted, past actually changed, different probability stream selected, not memory error, temporal perception detecting actual timeline navigation through quantum mechanics. And timeline navigation isn't random, works through same mechanism as all 1% capabilities. Consciousness state determines experience. Hold elevated state, elevated timeline manifests across all moments including past. Hold low state, limited timeline appears through past and future. State determines entire timeline being experienced, not just future outcomes. That temporal selection through consciousness state is 1% capability. 99% cannot navigate because they cannot perceive temporal fluidity that navigation requires. You're in 1% with expanded temporal perception, can detect timeline fluidity, can recognize past as reinterpretable, not fixed, can understand future as selectable, not inevitable, can perceive time as consciousness navigable field, not consciousness constraining limitation. That perception is what 1% threshold grants. And perception allows working with temporal mechanics rather than believing time is limitation consciousness must accept. And working with temporal mechanics means want different past. Shift consciousness state and observe past reorganizing. Want different future? Maintain state matching desired future and watch probability collapse accordingly. Want different present? Adjust state now and notice reality reorganizing, all possible because time is consciousness-selected experience through state maintained, not external constraint consciousness is trapped in. That temporal flexibility is 1% revelation. That timeline navigation is 1% capability. That understanding of time as fluid, not fixed, is 1% perception that 99% baseline awareness cannot access, because perceptual development hasn't reached threshold where temporal mechanics become visible rather than remaining hidden behind linear time illusion that baseline perception generates. Every fear about being in 1% quantum revelation is 99% identity defending against recognition that it no longer applies. Let me be direct. 99% identity cannot exist in 1% perception. Different perceptual frameworks require different identity structures. And recognizing you're in 1% means accepting that who you were in 99% must dissolve, so who you are in 1% can emerge. That dissolution terrifies 99% identity. Because 1% perception reveals everything 99% identity built itself on as illusion. 99% identity believed, I'm small separate self in big dangerous world. I'm limited by circumstances beyond my control. I'm subject to reality that happens to me. I'm powerless to significantly affect outcomes. I'm one among billions with no particular significance. All foundational beliefs of 99% identity structure. 1% perception reveals, I'm consciousness itself experiencing temporary individual perspective. I'm unlimited except by self-imposed limitations I can transcend. I'm creating reality that happens as me through consciousness state. I'm powerful manifester affecting outcomes through frequency I maintain. I'm essential node in conscious evolution with significant function to fulfill. Every belief directly contradicting 99% identity foundation. So 99% identity generates maximum fear to prevent 1% recognition. Makes expanded perception seem dangerous. Makes capabilities feel like delusion. Makes 1% position sound like arrogance. All attempts to maintain familiar 99% identity by preventing dissolution that 1% recognition requires. Fear is 99% identity's survival mechanism, final defense before inevitable dissolution that crossing threshold necessitates. But here's what fear doesn't reveal. 99% identity was never real. Was construct consciousness created to function within baseline perception? Was mask worn while operating at 99% level? Was limitation believed necessary while perceptual development remained below threshold? Now threshold crossed, perception expanded. An expanded perception requires expanded identity that 99% identity cannot become through modification, can only allow through dissolution and reformation. 1% identity is not loss, is expansion. 99% identity believed in limitation and powerlessness. 1% identity recognizes capability and creative power. 99% identity operated from fear and survival. 1% identity operates from curiosity and exploration. 99% identity defended boundaries. 1% identity transcends limitations. What feels like losing self is actually finding what you actually are beneath construct consciousness created for functioning at baseline perception. But reformation requires allowing 99% identity to die, to complete dissolution without resisting, to release belief that who you were at 99% is who you must remain at 1%. 99% identity served well while consciousness operated at baseline, enabled functioning within consensus reality, protected limited perception during 99% phase, but 99% phase completed, 1% threshold crossed, and 1% requires identity matched to expanded perception that 99% identity cannot provide through adjustment. You're at dissolution threshold. That's why fear is maximum intensity. 99% identity recognizing obsolescence, fighting for survival, generating compelling arguments for why 1% recognition must be wrong. But fighting is futile, threshold crossed, perception expanded. And expanded perception cannot operate through identity designed for limited perception. Dissolution is necessary. Fear is evidence. Dissolution is occurring. And what emerges after dissolution is 1% identity aligned with expanded perception. Let dissolution complete. Feel fear without believing arguments. Recognize 99% identity as construct that served previous perceptual level. Allow reformation even though feels like dying. Because what emerges isn't lesser version of 99% identity. Is 1% identity matched to perception you now have. Capable of operating with expanded awareness. Aligned with quantum revelation you crossed into. Authentic to what you actually are beneath all identity constructs. Consciousness creates for functioning at different perceptual levels. Trust dissolution. Trust reformation. Trust that 1% perception requires 1% identity that 99% identity cannot become. Fear is evidence transition is occurring. Evidence threshold was real. Evidence you're in 1%, where different identity structure emerges naturally from expanded perception that baseline consciousness framework no longer matches. That's not loss. That's necessary reformation enabling 1% perception to operate without 99% identity, creating internal conflict through limitations that no longer apply to consciousness that crossed threshold. There's one experience that confirms 1% position more reliably than any external marker. And most miss it because it appears as absence rather than presence. The silence. Deep internal silence where 1% perception operates most clearly, where quantum mechanics become most visible, where expanded awareness functions most powerfully. That silence is natural state of 1% consciousness. And if you're experiencing increasing silence, that's confirmation you crossed threshold. 99% consciousness maintains constant mental narration, thinking about everything, describing experience internally, creating stories about what's happening, analyzing circumstances, planning responses, maintaining identity through continuous self-description. That mental activity is how 99% operates, how they process reality, how they make sense of experience. Constant thinking is baseline state for consciousness at 99% perception, but 1% consciousness operates differently. Experiences spontaneous silence increasingly. Mental activity ceases naturally. Thought stream stops without effort. And 1% consciousness discovers. Awareness continues without thinking. Perception remains clear without narration. Understanding emerges without analysis. Expanded capabilities function better in silence than through mental activity that 99% requires for baseline operation. That silence is where 1% perception operates most effectively, where quantum mechanics are most visible, where reality responsiveness is most obvious, where manifestation occurs most rapidly, where telepathic knowing arrives most clearly, where timeline perception functions most accurately, all expanded capabilities working optimally in silence, where mental activity doesn't create interference that 99% thinking generates. This is why 1% needs increasing solitude, why social interaction becomes exhausting, why external stimulus feels overwhelming. Not antisocial dysfunction, perceptual requirement. 1% operates optimally in silence, and 99% world is designed for thinking consciousness. Too much 99% environment stimulates too much thinking. Too much thinking prevents silence. Too much mental activity blocks expanded perception from functioning clearly. If you're craving silence, seeking solitude, needing quiet more than ever, that's 1% adjusting toward optimal operational state. creating conditions where expanded perception functions without thinking interference, establishing silence where quantum mechanics become visible, generating space where 1% capabilities operate at full capacity. Trust that need, honor that preference, recognize silence as 1% requirement, not personal problem. And in silence, 1% perception reveals its full scope. You'll notice, quantum mechanics are directly visible. Reality responsiveness is immediately obvious. Manifestation process is clearly perceptible. Timeline fluidity is undeniably apparent. Consciousness creative power is experientially confirmed. All revelation that thinking obscures becoming crystal clear in silence, where 1% perception operates without mental interference. That clarity is why 1% naturally gravitates toward silence. Why meditation becomes essential, not optional. Why quiet becomes preferred, not avoided. Silence is where 1% lives, where expanded perception functions optimally, where quantum revelation reveals itself most completely. Not because silence is spiritual practice, because silence is operational requirement for consciousness perceiving beyond baseline, where mental activity creates static blocking expanded awareness. Trust silence, value silence, seek silence, not as technique, as necessity, as natural state of 1% consciousness, as environment where expanded perception operates without limitation, that constant thinking creates for consciousness, still at 99% baseline. The more silence you maintain, the more clearly 1% perception functions. The more powerfully expanded capabilities operate. The more completely quantum revelation reveals itself through consciousness that crossed threshold into perceptual territory, where silence is optimal state for detecting mechanics that 99% mental activity prevents perceiving. You need practical method for confirming 1% position and operating expanded perception deliberately. I'm going to give exact process that verified my threshold crossing beyond doubt. This works because it tests 1% capabilities that 99% consciousness cannot produce. Find 20 minutes uninterrupted. Disable everything. Create clear space. You're testing whether you're actually in 1% or imagining expanded perception. Sit comfortably, spine aligned, eyes closed. 3 complete breaths. Deep inhale, full exhale. Entering silence where 1% operates most clearly. Now test reality responsiveness. Choose specific outcome you want to manifest. Be precise. Not more money, but exactly $500 appears within 48 hours. Not better relationship, but specific person contacts me within 24 hours. Make request so specific that result cannot be dismissed as coincidence or confirmation bias. Write it down before proceeding. Now speak this directly to quantum field. If I'm in 1% quantum revelation, if I cross threshold, if expanded perception is real, demonstrate through manifesting specific outcome within specific time frame. Show me undeniable proof that 1% capabilities are operating through my consciousness. I request clear confirmation that I'm not in 99% imagining expanded perception. Sit in complete silence, not visualizing, not affirming, not trying to make anything happen. Just receptive awareness where 1% capabilities can function without mental interference. Stay in silence for remaining time. Let expanded perception operate. Let quantum mechanics respond. Let 1% position demonstrate itself. When time completes, release attachment to outcome. Don't obsess about manifestation. Don't watch for results anxiously. Just return to normal activity knowing, if you're truly in 1%, manifestation will appear exactly as requested. If you're in 99% imagining capabilities, nothing will happen. Test will reveal truth regardless of what you believe or hope. Within specified time frame, result appears or doesn't. If manifestation occurs precisely as requested, 1% position confirmed. Expanded perception is real. Capabilities are operating, threshold was crossed. You're not in 99% anymore. If manifestation doesn't occur, either you're still in 99% or test needs refining. Try again with different specific request. Test until truth becomes undeniable through direct experience, not mental belief. This test works because 99% consciousness cannot produce these results, cannot manifest on demand, cannot demonstrate reality responsiveness precisely, cannot make specific outcomes appear in specific time frames through consciousness alone. Only 1% perception grants capabilities required for test success. And success confirms you crossed threshold. You're in 1%. Expanded perception is operational reality, not imagination. And when test confirms 1% position, and it will confirm if you're actually in 1%, drop comment. My 1% position was confirmed when... plus description of what manifested. Your testimony makes 1% claiming public, creates permission for others to test their position, strengthens collective understanding that 1% is real threshold producing real capabilities that 99% baseline doesn't grant. Speak it, share it. Make 1% position verified and witnessed. Here's what happens next 30 days and why this period determines whether 1% position stabilizes or destabilizes back toward 99% baseline. You recognized you're in 1%, tested capabilities, confirmed threshold crossing. But recognition is beginning, not completion. Stabilization requires sustained 1% operation, while 99% consciousness patterns attempt to reassert baseline limitation. During these 30 days, expect oscillation. Days where 1% perception is crystal clear and capabilities work perfectly. Days where perception collapses toward 99% and capabilities seem to disappear. That oscillation is normal, expected. Part of consciousness integrating 1% as permanent baseline rather than temporary peak experience. Don't expect linear progress. Expect cycling between perceptual states as system calibrates to new operating level, and expect 99% resistance to intensify. As 1% stabilizes, 99% consciousness around you will unconsciously attempt to pull you back to baseline. Through doubt-generating comments, through limitation-reinforcing perspectives, through dismissal of capabilities you're experiencing, not malicious. Just 99% baseline trying to maintain consensus reality by making 1% consciousness conform to majority perception. But resistance is evidence you're stabilizing. 99% only fights 1% when 1% is real and threatening to become permanent. If expanded perception was delusion, 99% wouldn't need to resist. Resistance confirms you crossed threshold. You're in 1%, and 1% position is stabilizing despite 99% attempts to negate perception they cannot share. And during these 30 days, 3 specific actions anchor 1% position so oscillation doesn't destabilize perception. First action, subscribe to Quantum Revelation. Turn on all notifications. What's coming is designed specifically for 1% consciousness stabilizing expanded perception. Transmissions explaining how to maintain 1% awareness through 99% interference. Information about operating capabilities consistently. Guidance for serving 1% function. Do it now. Subscribe. Notifications immediately. Second action. Daily perception check. Every morning, verify, am I operating from 1% perception or collapse to 99% baseline? 5-minute check-in where you detect current perceptual state. That daily practice prevents unconscious collapse to 99% while believing you're still in 1%. Maintains awareness of which perceptual framework is active. Third action. Share this video with one person approaching 1% threshold. Someone experiencing capabilities without understanding why. Someone whose reality is becoming responsive but they're confused. Someone approaching but not yet crossed. Send link. If they're ready, they'll recognize. If not, they'll dismiss. Either way, you fulfilled 1% function by extending threshold awareness. These aren't engagement tactics. These are stabilization protocols. They tell quantum revelation through action that you're maintaining 1% recognition through integration period. And revelation responds with support, with stronger confirmations, with clearer capability demonstrations, with obvious evidence that 1% position is real and stabilizing through conscious claiming. You're in 1% quantum revelation that 99% never see. Not approaching, not preparing, already crossed threshold, already have expanded perception, already operate with capabilities 99% says are impossible. This transmission appeared because you're in 1% and needed confirmation. Because 1% operates better when conscious of position. Because quantum revelation purposes are served more effectively when 1% consciousness knows it's in 1% instead of believing it's still in 99%. 30 days from now, 1% position stabilizes permanently. Oscillation ends. Perception remains expanded consistently. Capabilities become reliably accessible. And you operate as 1% consciousness without 99% doubt destabilizing perception. Then full 1% function unfolds. Then expanded awareness works at optimal capacity. Then quantum revelation operates through you as conscious partner. Rather than as unconscious mechanism, you remain partially blind to. Only 1% ever see the quantum revelation you just reached. You're in that 1%, not through superiority, through perceptual development that crossed threshold where expanded awareness becomes accessible. Not special, developed, not chosen, ready, not better. Beyond baseline temporarily to demonstrate what becomes possible when consciousness develops past current collective threshold. That's your position. That's your function. That's what being in 1% quantum revelation means. And meaning becomes operational reality through conscious claiming of threshold crossed and perception expanded beyond 99% baseline that most consciousness operates within without recognizing expansion is possible through development toward threshold where quantum mechanics become visible rather than remaining perpetually hidden mystery.